Assalamualaikum, my name is AC240 and today I will explain about our background of study. Firstly, our study title is Macroeconomic Determinants of GDP Growth and Inflation Target Analysis among selected countries between 2010 to 2025. Firstly, macroeconomic indicators are important measures used to evaluate a country's economic performance. Indicators such as GDP growth, inflation rate, unemployment rate, interest rate, public debt and tax revenue helps government and policymakers monitor economic conditions and formulate appropriate economic policy. However, in recent years, many countries have experienced economic challenges, including rising inflation, economic slowdowns, and increasing public debt. These changes has affected economic growth and created a greater challenges for government in maintaining stable and sustainable economic development. According to the International Monetary Fund (IMF) 2024, global public debt is expected to exceed $100 trillion, equivalent to approximately 93% of global GDP in 2024, and it may reach 100% of global GDP by 2030. This highlights the importance of understanding how macroeconomic factors can influence a country's economic performance. However, most previous studies have focused on a single country or only a few macroeconomic indicators. Comparative studies involving multiple countries remain limited, making it difficult to obtain a wider understanding of global economic trends. Therefore, this study aims to analyze global macroeconomic indicators among selected countries from 2010 to 2035. The findings are expected to provide useful insights to policymakers, researchers, other stakeholders in understanding global economic performance and further support informed economic decision making. Moving on to our objective of the study. The first objective is to describe the distribution of GDP growth, inflation rate, and unemployment rate among selected countries based on years. The second objective is to determine whether the mean inflation rate differs significantly from the World Bank target inflation rate of 2%. Last but not least, our third objective is to determine the significant macroeconomic factors affecting the GDP growth among selected countries and to identify the most influential indicators among inflation rates, unemployment rate, interest rate, public debt, and tax revenue. The findings of these studies are expected to benefit several groups. Firstly, policymakers and governments in formulating effective economic policies. Second is investors and businesses in understanding economic conditions. And lastly, researchers, students, and other academic community by providing useful references for future studies. This study uses a secondary dataset, which obtained from Kaggle website entitled Global Economic Indicators 2010 to 2035. The dataset contains macroeconomic information from multiple countries between 2010 to 2035. The population of these studies consists of all country year economic records available in the dataset. From this population, a sample of 200 country year observation was selected for our analysis. The sample size of this study is 200 observations, which we'll analyze using SPSS to achieve our research objective. The variables used in the study are GDP growth, inflation rate, unemployment rate, interest rate, public debt, and tax revenue. All of these variables are quantitative and continuous variables that represent a different aspect of a country's economic performance.
Now let's move on to the method of analysis, which is part of our methodology section. This table summarizes the statistical methods we use based on each objective of our study. We have 3 objectives in this study, and each one requires a different type of statistical analysis. For objective 1, which is to describe the distribution of GDP growth, inflation rate, and unemployment rate among selected countries based on years, the variables involved are GDP growth, percent annual, inflation rate percent, unemployment rate percent, along with countries and years. All 3 main variables are quantitative and continuous in nature. Since this objective is about to describing and summarizing the data, we use descriptive statistics, specifically the mean and line graph, to show the overall pattern and trend over time. For objective 2, which is to determine whether the mean inflation rate differs significantly from the World Bank's target inflation rate of 2%, the variable involved is inflation, measured by CPI percent, which is also quantitative and continuous. Because this objective involves testing a specific value against our sample data, we use one simple test, specifically the one sample t-test. For objective 3, which is to determine the significant macroeconomic factors affecting GDP growth and to identify the most influential predictor, here we have one dependent variable, GDP growth percent annual, and 5 independent variables, inflation CPI percent, unemployment rate percent, interest rate percent, public debt percent of GDP, and tax revenue percent of GDP. All of these are quantitative and continuous, since we are testing the relationship between one dependent variable and multiple independent variables. We use multiple linear regression.
We chose SPSS as our sole analytical tool because it is uniquely optimized for managing panel datasets that track multiple indicators across time. allowing us to organize all 200 of our observation rows efficiently. This software provided the necessary processing capability to generate our descriptive mean tracking line graph. More importantly, it gave us the mathematical precision required to construct our parametric one-sample t-test and also multiple regression model with exact coefficients and significance value. Table and figure 3.1, we can see that the average GDP growth was highest in 2010, around 6.66%. After that, GDP growth remained relatively stable, mostly ranged in between 1 and 3.5 from 2011 to 2019. However, there was a sharp decline to negative 7.45% in 2020, which was mainly caused by the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. As countries begin to recover and economic activities resume, GDP growth increased to 4.81% in 2021. It then gradually stabilized, reaching 2.42 in 2023. Next, I will present the descriptive analysis of the inflation rate. Based on table and figure 3.2, the inflation rate fluctuated considerably throughout the study period. It reached its highest level of 12 and 51% in 2013, mainly due to rising global commodity prices before declining to its lowest point of 2.15% in 2016. During the COVID-19 pandemic, inflation increased again and reached a post-pandemic peak of 11.49% in 2022. This increase was largely driven by supply chain disruption, government stimulus measures, and the global energy crisis. Moving on, I will present the descriptive analysis of the unemployment rate. Based on table and figure 3.3, the unemployment rate fluctuated throughout the study period. It increased from 7.2% in 2010 to 9.86% in 2012 before declining to 6.67% in 2014. However, the unemployment rate rose and reached at its highest level of 11.61% in 2022, which was reflecting the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Following the reopening of business and the recovery of economic activities, the unemployment rate declined to 7.03% in 2021 and then remained relatively stable at 7.13% in 2022.
We conducted a one-sample t-test to evaluate whether the global mean inflation rate across our sample deviates significantly from the World Bank established target of 2%. As shown in Table 3.4, our sample consists of 200 observations spanning from 2010 to 2023, yielding an overall sample mean inflation rate of 6.71%. To determine if this difference is statistically meaningful, we tested our null hypothesis, which stated that the mean global inflation rate is equal to 2%. Our inferential testing yielded a t-statistical of 6.380 with 199 degrees of freedom. Crucially, the two-tailed significant p-value is less than 0.001. Because this p-value is far below our significant threshold alpha of 0.05, we confidentially reject the null hypothesis. In conclusion, we find that the actual global mean inflation rate of 6.71% is statistically and significantly higher than 2% benchmark, with a mean difference of 4.71%. Economically, this reflects a widespread structural failure to maintain a price stability over the studied timeframe, largely driven by catastrophic macroshocks, including the COVID-19 pandemic, severe supply chains bottlenecks, and the subsequent global energy crisis. Now we look at the model summary in Table 3.5 to evaluate how well our independent macroeconomics variables collectively predict annual GDP growth. First, our multiple correlation coefficients is 0.257. According to our statistical criteria, this value indicates a weak positive correlation between our 5 macroeconomics predictors: tax revenue, inflation, interest rate, public debt, and unemployment, and the dependent variable, GDP growth. Second, look at the R-square value. It stands at 0.066. This explicitly reveals that only 6.6% of the variation in annual GDP growth can be explained by these 5 macroeconomic factors within our sample countries. Consequently, the remaining 63.4% of the variance, which we calculated by subtracting 6.6% from 100%, is caused by outside factors completely omitted from this model, such as political stability, industrial productivity, or trade dynamics. This weak explanatory power is highly consistent with our previous coefficient findings, where none of these individual predictors managed to achieve statistical significance.
Moving on, I will present the inflation analysis using the ANOVA test. The purpose of this test is to determine whether the selected macroeconomic factors such as inflation rate, unemployment rate, interest rate, public debt, and also tax revenue have significant effect of GDP growth. First, we state the hypothesis. The null hypothesis, which is H0, states that none of these macroeconomic factors significantly affect GDP growth, while the alternative hypothesis, which is H1, states that at least one of these factors has a significant effect. Next, the significance level is set at 0.05. Based on table 3.6, the ANOVA results shows an F-value of 0.468 with p-value of 0.797. Since the p-value is greater than 0.05, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. Therefore, at 5% significance level, there is insufficient statistical evidence to conclude that the inflation rate, unemployment rate, interest rate, public debt, and tax revenue have significant effect on GDP growth. This suggests that, as a whole, these 5 variables do not significantly explain the variation in GDP growth in this study.
Now we look at our regression coefficient table to see how our individual macroeconomics predictors affects our annual GDP growth. As shown in our estimated regression equation on the right, the model starts with a baseline constant of 4.716%. This implies that if all our independent variables were equal to 0, our predicted annual GDP growth would be 4.716%. When looking at the individual relationships, we see that an increase in inflation, unemployment, interest rates, and tax revenues all have a negative impact on growth, while public debt has a minor positive relationship. For instance, every 1% increase in inflation is expected to decrease GDP growth by 0.240%. However, the most critical finding on this slide is our statistical significance. Using a standard 5% significant level, none of our macroeconomics predictors are statistically significant. If we look at the said column, every single calculated p-value is substantially greater than our alpha 0.05 threshold. Because every p-value fails to cross the significant barrier, we cannot technically establish a reliable ranking of relative or absolute structural influence among these variables. Empirically, this tells us that within our sample and time frame, changes in these individual indicators did not have a statistically dependable, measurable effects on moving annual GDP growth rate.
Objective 1 was to describe the distribution of GDP growth, inflation, and unemployment by year. We found that all 3 indicators fluctuated significantly over the period, with 2020 standing out clearly as a turning point. GDP growth dropped to as low as -7.45% inflation, and unemployment both rose sharply, and all 3 showed a general recovery pattern in the years after. Objective 2 was to determine whether the mean inflation rate differs significantly from the World Bank's 2% target. The one sample t-test showed that the average inflation rate of 6.71% was significantly higher than the 2% target, with a small to moderate effect size. This confirms that inflation consistently exceeded the benchmark rather than fluctuating. Objective 3 was to identify the significant macroeconomic factors affecting GDP growth. The multiple regression model using inflation, unemployment, interest rate, public debt, and tax revenue was not statistically significant, and none of the 5 predictors were significant individually. This means within our sample, these variables did not meaningfully explain the variation in the GDP growth. Based on these findings, here are our practical suggestions and recommendations for future research. First, increase the sample size and use better missing data handling, such as multiple imputation instead of list-wise deletion, since our regression was based on only 39 valid cases. Second, expand the set of predictor variables to include the factors like foreign direct investment, exchange rate volatility, or trade openness, and consider lag effects since economic impacts often show up a year or more later. Third, use panel data techniques such as phased or random effects regression to account for structural differences between countries instead of pulling all data together. And fourth, analyze 2020 separately since it's a clear outlier year to see how much is driving to overall results. And finally, improve documentation and transparency, clearly reporting data sources, countries included, and consistent variable definitions for future replication.